As I stood on Trafalgar's shore, I saw the wooden walls once more, and in the shimmering sun I wept for all the men and boys who slept. Their bones beneath the heaving flow, unfathomable depths below, where they had lain since cannons roared, as all around them grape shot poured. When British heroes called to test their power against a second best, showed then, as they had oft before, that they were there to win the war. I wept again and thought I saw a slight man tumble to the floor. And as he did, the cannons roared, as all around him grape shot poured. And did I feel the sun cool then, as he fell there amongst his men? This son of Norfolk stock, condemned to barely see his day's work end. They brought him news his task was done. He left them 'neath the setting sun. And as he did, his men made fast the cannons, silent now at last. Upon his desk they found the prayer composed beneath his candle's glare, in which he asked that God would aid their joint endeavours unafraid. Then, as the day turned into night, they towed the victory from the fight. And late December saw him home, to lie for good 'neath Wren's great dome. This year again, just as before, I stood upon Trafalgar's shore, and once again I felt the tears, as looking back across the years, from where he fell to where I stood, I saw the force, the sweat, the blood my countrymen had shed in vain, on heaving seas and ridge and plain. In order that as years went by, and with the aid of him on high, this land with help from heaven sent would still be fit to compliment the efforts made by them that day, when Nelson and his like held sway, whilst all around them cannons roared, and through the air the grape shot poured. The efforts made by them that day, when Nelson and his like held sway, whilst all around them cannons roared, and through the air the grape shot poured. May the great God whom I worship grant to my country, and for the benefit of Europe in general, a great and glorious victory. And may no misconduct in any one tarnish it. And may humanity, after victory, be the predominant feature of the British fleet. For myself, individually, I commit my life to him who made me, and may his blessings light upon my endeavours for serving my country faithfully. To him I resign myself and the just cause which is entrusted to me to defend. Amen. 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 That devotion was written by Viscount Admiral Lord Nelson in his cabin aboard HMS Victory, the flagship of the British fleet, just hours before the battle which was to signal the end of the combined Spanish and French fleet and dispel finally any vestige of threat to invade these shores. This battle on the heaving seas off Cape Trafalgar, between the two mighty fleets of Napoleonic France and the Royal Navy, was the final clash that was to end in our victory and the culmination of Lord Nelson's brilliant career. A career in which he had already given an eye and an arm, and was to give on this day, October the 21st, 1805, the ultimate sacrifice, his life. Horatio Nelson became a legend in his own short lifetime. He was lauded by kings, honoured by a grateful monarch and parliament, idolised almost to the point of hysteria by a public the length and breadth of these islands, and perhaps most important to Nelson himself, he was loved by his men and almost worshipped by his junior officers. And yet this great man, the supreme naval tactician of his age, humane, vain, courageous, cast by circumstances into an heroic mould, was born the son of a country parson. He was not quite 5 feet 6 inches tall, frail in stature, and subject to violent seasickness. He was born in a typically large family in Burnham Thorpe, Norfolk, in September 1758, the Catherine who secured him his first chance towards his naval career. Her uncle, Captain Maurice Suckling, with whom Horatio first went to sea, wrote at the time, "What has poor little Horatio done that he should rough it at sea? But let him come, and if a cannonball takes off his head, he will at least be provided for." Despite all this, the small, delicate lad thrived, and as a cabin boy sailed to the West Indies and took part in a polar expedition. By the time he was 22 years old, he was a post captain and had served in the American War of Independence. There he was to gain much valuable experience. Prince William, who was later to become King William IV, described Nelson, who he met whilst in the West Indies himself as a serving naval officer, as the merriest boy of a captain I have beheld. But he added later in the same letter, "Yet there was something irresistibly pleasing in his address and conversation, and an enthusiasm speaking on professional subjects that showed he was no common being." When he was 28 years old, he met and married a young widow, Frances Nesbit, and when his ship was paid off, he, in common with many junior officers, retired on half pay. He took his wife to the peaceful solitude of his native county. He began to despair that he would ever go to sea again, but on the continent the ominous clouds of war were gathering again, and in January 1793 the French Revolutionary Wars erupted, and we were once again at war. He literally deluged the Admiralty with requests for a command, and finally he was given a 64-gun ship of the line. He was at sea again. During the next 4 years he gained a reputation for gallantry while seeming at times to be somewhat foolhardy, but he sailed the Mediterranean full of enthusiasm despite being plagued by ill health, and during the siege of Corsica he suffered the first of his injuries when he lost the sight of one eye. His men and junior officers were fired by his example, and it was here in the Mediterranean that the real legend of Nelson began. Here too began the idolatry of those who served under him. However, with the whole of Europe now engaged against Britain, the Navy was forced to recall its ships, and during this evacuation Nelson performed one of those deeds which were to prove his great humanity. He risked almost certain destruction of his ship to rescue a man who had fallen overboard whilst being pursued by 2 enemy battleships. On this occasion his luck held and he escaped. Shortly afterwards he was involved in the Battle of St. Vincent. Here the fleet was commanded by Admiral Jervis, but it was Nelson, with his instinctive genius, who was decisive in winning the day. He disregarded his orders, placed his ship, the smallest in the fleet, against the giant 4-deck Spanish battleships and 4 other enemy ships, and prevented them from rejoining the rest of the fleet already split asunder by Jervis. Nelson went on to capture 2 enemy vessels in this battle, and for this action was created Knight of the Bath. After this success he was dispatched to capture the fortress of Tenerife, and here he suffered failure and sustained an injury to his arm which was to result in amputation. Despite his ill health and the effects of fairly primitive surgery, he survived and was able, after only 9 months of often painful convalescence, to rejoin the fleet. There began an elusive chase by the then Vice Admiral Nelson of Napoleon's fleet up and down the Mediterranean Sea in an attempt to bring the French to battle. The time spent in this pursuit, however, was not wasted. His men were exercised daily with cannon and small arms, and his captains attended many discussions during which they digested Nelson's plans. The results of these efforts bore fruit on August the 1st, 1798, when, at last, Nelson's ships caught the French at anchor in Aboukir Bay. All that night the battle raged, and the next day Nelson learnt of the complete and utter rout of the enemy. Out of 13 principal ships, the Bonapartists had lost 9 captured and 2 destroyed. During this engagement, Nelson received a further injury, this time a head wound, which was to leave him sick and to some extent delirious for some weeks. He was in action again less than 2 years later at the Battle of Copenhagen. It was in this particularly brutal and hard-won victory that Horatio placed his telescope to his blind eye and ignored his superior's order to cease action, and gradually the Danish fleet succumbed. Thus, again, Nelson had denied the Napoleonic plan of victory for Europe. Next followed the blockade of the French ports. For 2 years, in all weathers, British ships stood and patrolled off all the major French ports in an effort to bring them to a decisive battle. But the French, demoralised by defeat after defeat, refused for all practical purposes to rise to the challenge. But Napoleon, determined to invade Britain and, in his own words, avenge 6 centuries of shame and insult, in coalition with Spain, instructed the battleships to sail to support his waiting armies. Just after dawn that fateful day, the fleet sighted one another, and at midday the fighting commenced. The rest is known well. Nelson, the hero, fell mortally wounded on the deck of the Victory, but somehow survived long enough to be told of the success of the British fleet and his final vindication. Nelson's orders, "England expects this day that every man shall do his duty," fluttered from the yardarms of the Victory that day, and on the anniversary at noon, HMS Victory still displays that famous signal of an admiral whose death plunged the entire nation into grief. The fabulous Victory almost 200 years ago was therefore not only a tribute to the fighting spirit and exemplary gunnery of the British fleet, but also of Nelson's absolute devotion to the concept of success. His will, his example, his leadership, his determination that every junior officer and deckhand were made aware through their continual practice, and his captain's meetings of his strategy for the ensuing battle, these factors and his almost overpowering presence on the quarterdeck of the Victory that day, coupled with the knowledge that every sailor within the fleet knew that he would not even remotely comprehend anything other than victory, won the day's fight. Not only did the defeat mean the end of Napoleon's battleships, but it was also to lead, ultimately some 10 years later, to the end of the little corporal's dreams of European dominance on the fields of Waterloo. And of course, this time, it was the iron will of yet another Briton, the Duke of Wellington, who was to conduct his final downfall. Throughout the history of these islands, we have been blessed with the fortunate ability to find in our hours of most desperate need men of supreme genius and courage. Across the centuries, spanning Alfred the Great to Sir Winston Churchill in 1940, the name of Horatio Nelson burns still as bright as the beacons that we have so often fired in those darkest hours of our nation's history.